Today I'm filming a sew along for the Nullarbor Cami. So I have all my pieces cut out. I'm using a scrap of this Tencel twill left over. So I've got all my pieces cut out. I have my front piece, my back pieces, and I've also cut out my facing. So this is the front facing, and I've cut out interfacing and I've fused it to the back there. Here are my back facing pieces and my strap pieces. So I like to lay things out really kind of nicely like this to make sure that I'm not sewing the wrong thing to the wrong thing. It's not really an issue with this project, it's quite simple, but when it comes to something a little bit more complicated, I think it's just a good habit to get into. The other thing that's a little bit tricky about this fabric is the right and wrong sides are very, very similar. Like, you probably can't even see it on the camera, and I've spent like a long time peering very closely at the weave of the fabric. Because of this, I've been sure to lay it out right sides to right sides. The right side of this has a very slight sheen to it, and I just want to make sure that I've got that correct. So I mean, just over the years I've developed a system where basically I always have my right sides sitting together when I have them like on a table or something. So these are my back pieces. The first thing I'm going to do is take my back pieces and I'm going to sew the center back seam. So I'm going to lay them on top of each other. You can pop a couple of pins in if you like. Just going to get this front piece out of the way. So you can pin it. It's going to be a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. All the seam allowances on this pattern are quite small, so just 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. And I've done that just so that we can squeeze it into the least amount of fabric possible. So I'm going to sew that center back seam. I'm also going to sew the center back seam of my facings, my back facings. So the center back seam is the one that is at a right angle. The side seam is the one that's at an angle. So I'm going to sew the center back seam of that as well. So here's the back piece. I also went ahead and I finished the edge of this and I pressed the seam over to one side. I used a serger or an overlocker. You can also zigzag it. If you don't like zigzagging and you don't want to use an overlocker, then you can French seam this. You will have to add extra seam allowance though, so probably should have said this at the beginning, but if you do want a French seam, then you'll need at least a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, which is 5/8 of an inch, I think. So yeah, so if that's the case, then you'd do that and you would French seam as usual with your wrong sides together. Anyway, I'm serging, so I've pressed that to one side, finished the seams together and pressed them to one side. And I've, for the back facing, I just pressed the seams open there. Okay, let's get on to sewing this dart. So, here's my front piece, and because I laid it out before, I know that I have my right sides together. So I have my notches here on the side for the dart. So I'm just going to pinch that at this corner here. I have my apex marked with a drill hole. I don't know if you can see that, but I just poked it with a stiletto or an awl. It doesn't actually make a permanent hole, it just temporarily kind of parts the weave. So what I'm doing is I'm lining up the notches for the dart like that, and then pinching it over so that the drill hole is at the other end. Just marking a pin this way so that I can see where I'm going to end. If you are nervous about sewing your dart, you can draw it on with a chalk line and follow the chalk line. I don't need to do that, so I'm not going to, but I'm going to match my notches at the other end. You can pop a pin in. So you'll sew from the side seam edge towards the apex of the dart. I like to sew it in a very, very slight scoop. Do the last few stitches right along the edge here. Depending on your fabric, you can back tack if it's like a sturdier fabric, like a linen. On this kind of lighter weight fabric, I'm just gonna run off the edge and knot it by hand. So I'm going to sew those 2 darts and then I'm gonna press them down. Right, so I sewed that dart and I've pressed it down, and I just want to show you how I press that apex of the dart. So I have tailor's ham. This is a homemade one, so you can definitely make them. There's lots of free patterns online. Basically, it's just a nice kind of round shape. You can also buy them. And it's kind of conveniently slightly boob shaped. So have it with my wool side up, and then I can just place the dart over the top there. You can see how it just conforms to the shape of that dart. This is tensile, so it presses, it likes to put marks in itself. So I use a press cloth. This is a silk organza one. So I can just place it over the top and just press there to get the tip, the apex of that dart really nice and flat. So I have done that. Okay. I'm gonna do 2 steps now. So here's my front facing and my back facing. So I'm going to sew the front and back facings together at the side seams, again with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay. So you'll sew that one. And this one here. Here are my straps. So I have them placed right sides together. I'm going to fold them up right sides together. And then I'm going to sew them into a tube essentially. Right, so I'll sew down that long edge with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. And the same on the other strap. I'll come back and I'll show you how I use the loop turner to turn them. Right, so I've sewn these loops. Now, this is the loop turner that I use. There are many different styles. If you don't have a loop turner, actually, what you can do is you can get a piece of cord. I don't have any here right now, but if it's a piece of string or cord, I just placed that inside the loop, the tube before I sewed it, and then I actually just sewed across the edge just to secure it, and left a long tail. I could use that to help me turn it, but I do have a loop turner, so it's this kind. This is really for turning like a rouleau loop, like a bias loop, but it works well for this as well. So just gonna put it up the tube, and then there's a little hook here, so you're gonna just hook it through the fabric and make a little hole. And then there's a little latch, but I don't usually use it. And then you're just gonna pull on this end and pull it through. Sometimes what happens is the little loop kind of catches as you're pulling the tube through, which is a bit irritating. Oh, it's not doing it now, of course, that I want to show you. But anyway, that's how you do it. There we go. I'll do the other one. Put the loop turner through. Gonna catch it. If your fabric frays a lot, sometimes it'll just fray that edge off. So then you'll just want to, instead of looping it around the raw edge, you'll just pierce it slightly down. These straps are cut quite long on purpose so that you can trim them to, like, customize them to your size. But it also gives you, oops, I just lost the end. So this happens. So I'm just gonna have to turn it back inside out. What was I saying? I've forgotten. Anyway, that's okay. Turning it back. Oh yes, the straps are cut too long on purpose, so you can customize it to your shoulder and bust. So I'm gonna try that again. Concentrate this time instead of talking. So sometimes I find it helps if I kind of twist it a little bit. This is pretty silky, slippery fabric, so it's working pretty well. On something like a linen, it can be a little bit more of a challenge. Okay. So I'm gonna press these into a strap shape. I'm gonna press them so that the seam is gonna be completely on the back. So this is the side that you'll see. And just so you don't have like a seam on the edge or something, we're just gonna press it so that the seam is kind of centered on the back there. So I'm gonna press that. Right, so I've pressed those into place. The next thing is I'm going to sew the front to the back. So here's my front piece. I'm going to go right sides together, front and back, and sew the side seams. So I'm just going to pin it and show you. So you should have a notch in your back piece that aligns with this line of the dart here. So go ahead and align that. Make sure that you've gotten the dart pinned down nice and flush. And the rest of the side seam. So you're going to sew this with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. I'm going to finish them and I'm going to press them towards the back of the garment. Okay, so I have sewn my side seams. I'm going to turn my garment, no, I'm going to leave it inside out. That's what I'm going to do. So I have my facing here, it's in a loop. I've pressed all my seams open and I'm going to finish the edge of the facing. So you can do that in a variety of different ways. You can serge it, you can bind it using a Hong Kong bind, you could zigzag it, you could even like turn it under a little tiny bit and neatly stitch along the edge with a pin stitch. But basically you just want to finish that lower edge. Now would be a great time to put a label in the back if you want to do that. You can go ahead and do that and customize that facing for yourself. Okay, so I finished the edge and I put fantastic labels in. Now we're going to sew our facing to our garment, but without the straps. So here's the front of my garment and I have the right side facing up. And I'm going right side down with the facing. And I'm just going to pin that into place. When you're pinning, I think it's great to line up the kind of key points. So I'm lining up that, it's not really a V, it's like a curved V, the front of the neckline. And then because this part of the V-neck is on the bias, like it stretches quite easily. So, but I've interfaced this facing so that hasn't stretched. So what I can do is then find the midpoint between these two pins and match it up there, just to gently ease that in. So when I'm sewing, it'll sit nice and flat and it'll kind of ease that slightly stretched out neckline back into place. And do the same on this side. This side hasn't really stretched at all. Okay. Then I'm going to match my side seam. So this is the side seam here. I'm going to match those seams. I like to pop a pin straight through that stitching line there of the facing and checking it on the, checking it on the other side. Helps if you go all the way through to see if I've matched it. It's gonna be pretty good. And then again, match these curves here. Right, so I'll pin the rest of that. Okay, so you're going to sew 4 separate rows of stitching. So we need to leave space for that, for the straps, but we need to customize those. So we need to leave a space for the straps. So you're going to sew 1 line of stitching, so 1 centimeter seam allowance for the armhole, 1 for the back neck or back, leaving gaps here, 1 for the other armhole, and 1 for that front neckline. I would say my advice to you would be to take the most care on the front neckline because that's what you'll see, and we really want that to be a nice curve. The other thing you want to ensure is that there is enough space for your straps to fit through the gap that you're going to leave. It should be right if you do a 1 centimeter seam allowance and if your straps are accurate. There should be a gap between the stitching of about 1 inch. So you'll stitch up here and all the way up to the end. So all the way up to the end there. Right, so I sewed those 4 stitching lines. I need to customize the straps now. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to try it on inside out. So what I'd recommend you do is just maybe pin it at the back, remembering that, so you can pin it actually, so you got to remember there's a 1 centimeter seam allowance, so you can actually pin it into its place like this. And then when you try it on, it'll like flip over. So I'm just pinning the straps onto the back. This is just to get our length right. Okay. Flip this up and then put it on. If I were you, I would start with a finished length, so pin to pin of 12 inches. I like mine to be about 11 and a half. Some people like them to be like 14. So it's really individual. So just pin it to whatever, but then you can repin it at the front when you're trying it on. Make sure you look at it from the back. Remember that this neckline and the back neckline will be 1 centimeter lower because it's because of the seam allowance. We haven't trimmed that back. We haven't flipped it over yet. I would err on the side of too long. It's easier to shorten than to lengthen. You can also make it too long, and then once it's finished, you can kind of sew in, like hand sew just like a little loop like this at the back, just so you have some extra to make it adjustable later if you're really not sure. So go ahead and do that, and then I'll show you how to attach those straps in. Right, so I've determined that I like my finished straps to be 11 and a half centimeters long, sorry, 11 and a half inches long. So I'm going to show you how I trim them. The first thing I do is I just trim off one end very neatly. And then it's no good for me to cut it off at 11.5 because then I won't have any seam allowance. So I need to add my seam allowance. So it's 3/8 of an inch seam allowance on each end. So I guess 11.5 plus 3/8 of an inch is what? 12 and something. I can't do math. So 11.5. So I'm just laying my ruler. So I've got 11.5 there, plus I want to add 2 times 3/8 of an inch, so 6/8 of an inch. So that's 4/8, 5 and 6, so 12.25. And cut that off. You might have more. I cut these straps a little bit shorter. Then I'm just gonna do the other one the same. If your body isn't symmetrical, you might want to have them different lengths. That's fine too. So got my top back. So here's what I'm going to do. We just have to do a bit of visualization. So when I turn my top the right way, I want the outside, the nice side of the strap facing out, which means that the seam has to be facing the facing. So I'm taking the seam, I've got my seam side up and the facing's up, and I'm just going to thread it into this opening that we left. I feel like tweezers might be a good idea, but it's being fiddly. There we go. So it should neatly fit into that space there. I'm just going to back it off so that's exactly flush with that end. And I'm going to pop a pin in it. Now, so this is the front neckline. So that's the left side strap. So you want to make sure that each strap goes between a front and a back. I know it sounds silly, but you don't want a strap to go between, like across your chest. It's happened before. So making sure that it's not twisted at all. Just going to take it around to the back and thread it through there. So I've got my seam up, I'm going to back it back. Be aware it's going to bunch things up, okay, because that strap's shorter than the bottom armhole. That's okay. I'm going to do the same thing on the other strap. I happen to be starting at the back this time. Facing up and my seam up. Push it through, back it off. Making sure it's not twisted. Taking it through to the front. One worked better that time. Backing it back carefully. And pinning. Right, now I'm going to go ahead and do 4 short little rows of stitching straight across here with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Make sure that you're being really sturdy and back tacking well at each end. You only have to go between these stitching lines, like you don't have to go right to the edge. And in fact, if you do that when you clip, what's going to happen is you're going to cut your stitching line and it might come unraveled. If you choose, you can even do a little, like 3/4 of a box, like up here, across and down. that would be good too. So you're going to do that on all 4, and then I'll come back and show you how to grade and clip. Right, so I've sewn those straps in. The next step is to do some grading and clipping. Now, you want to be really careful that you're not accidentally cutting the garment side. And it's a bit tricky because that strap is all kind of bunched up. But we'll just go step by step. So when I'm grading, I don't want to cut any of the side that's going to be away from, that is part of the garment fabric. I want to only cut away the interfacing side, the facing side. So what that means is I'm going to lay it out flat on my hand like this and just cut away some of that extra bulk there. Sometimes I find it easier to use my clippers, sometimes I find it easier to use my scissors. Some people like duckbill scissors, but the key here is go slow and make sure you're not cutting anything you shouldn't. So I'm just cutting away just some of that seam allowance for the facing. So you'll do that all the way around. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to clip our curves. For this, I'm going to flip over, so I'm looking at the right side, and I do this just to make sure I'm not clipping anything I shouldn't. So for a concave curve like this, we're going to clip just straight snips. So you're going to clip pretty close to that stitching line, but not all the way to it and not too far away. And it's going to depend on your fabric. So I'm clipping, I don't know, 2 centimeters, 3/4 of an inch apart. The tighter the curve, the closer together you'll want to clip. So at this, as we reach that bottom of the neckline, I'm going to clip even closer together. Okay, I need to clip these corners off. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clip straight across here. Okay, give an extra clip in there. I'm going to cut this corner off as well. Then I've got my my strap in here. I'm going to cut some of that bulk out. That's so that it can turn nicely. I think with time and experience, you just kind of learn what you want to clip. So I'm going to do that on all of those strap corners. I'm going to grade all the way around, and then I will clip, and then I'll show you what to do next. So this is how I treat a seam. So this is the right side of the garment. I cut this bit off at an angle like that. And on the facing side, I really trim the seam allowance very close. Just that seam allowance of the side seam. So this is the center back. So I'm going to cut this off at an angle. You might need some little, I don't know, embroidery scissors or something. I don't own any, so using my big ones. Actually, I use my clippers for this. Then I'll go through and I'll actually sometimes cut a clip right into that seam allowance, okay? I think that really good grading and clipping will make the difference, and pressing actually, will make the difference between your garments looking like homemade in a bad way and handmade. So, as in, and when I say handmade, I mean like, you know, like an artisan quality, I suppose. Okay, so we're going to do some understitching. When we understitch, what we're essentially doing is catching these seam allowances towards the facing. So from this side, the right side, if I flip the seam allowances towards the facing, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch, so this is the facing here, I'm going to stitch just a pin's width away from that seam line, just to hold all of those seam allowances under. And what that does is when we press it, do the final pressing, it really holds that facing to the inside, rolls it in really nicely. It's really important. When we understitch this garment, so I'm just turning the facing over, just kind of gently pull the strap up. You can see there, you can see a little bit of a bump there where I haven't clipped very well. So I'm gonna go in, check out what's going on, suss it out. Oh yeah, so it looks like this bit needs to come off. Just being careful to not clip anything I shouldn't. Let's do some on the other side just for good luck. Okay, let's see now. That's better. Okay, so I'm gonna do that. I actually find it easier on this fabric at least to not press before I understitch, because the understitching kind of presses it for me. And that way when I'm sewing, I can go in and just be rolling it out, just always checking that I don't have any seam allowances hanging on the garment side. When you do the understitching, you're gonna do it in 4 chunks. You won't be able to get all the way up into here. So you'll probably end up starting the understitching just a little bit away from that strap, doing the curved part and finishing a little bit away from the strap again. So that's how that's going to go. So I'm going to understitch, and then what I'll do is I will press that facing down. Right, so I've done that understitching. I'm next going to press. So you can see how that understitching is kind of rolling that facing to the inside really nicely. So when I press it, there's no danger of it, like, of that seam kind of sitting too much to the outside. So I'm going to press it. I'm going to press it from the inside, just because, again, this is tencel. The next thing I'm going to do, because when we put it on, like, we don't want the facing like flapping, flapping up. So after I press it, I'm just going to go through on the side seams and on the center back seam, and I'm going to match the seam to the seam like that. Go to the outside. I'm going to pop a pin right in that ditch. So just right in where the stitching line was, making sure it's aligned with the inside. And then I'm just going to sew a short bit of stitching in the ditch. Maybe not even an inch, 3/4 of an inch. So just a couple of centimeters long, just along here towards the edge of that facing. And what that'll do is it'll be completely invisible, but it'll just hold the facing down. But I'm going to press it down before I do that. So press the facing, do the ditch stitching. Then the next thing I'm going to do, and I've already done it actually, is sew a row of stitching just a 1/4 inch in from the edge. So 5 millimeters in from the edge of the hem, and that'll help me press the hem up. Right. So I've just pressed it, and then I did that stitching in the ditch there. And you know, it just really does disappear. Like you can't really see it from the outside. You can see I didn't get it exactly on the inside. It doesn't really matter. It's close, but it just disappears and it'll hold that facing down for you. So the next thing you'll do is go to your ironing board and you're gonna press, first you'll press up just that 1/4 inch or 5 millimeters all the way around, using that stitching as a guide. It'll really help you. And then fold up another 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch for your hem. Then you can either hand stitch the hem or you can just machine it, so top stitch it with a stitch length of 3. I'm gonna just stitch it with my machine. So when I stitch it, I like to stitch from the inside, and I'll run my stitching line just a pin's width in from that fold there. So anyway, I hope this has helped you. I hope you enjoy wearing your cami. I really love wearing mine, and I want to make lots more. So hope you're having a good day.